Good morning. This is Dick Black, Senator Black, and we're at June 24th. This is Focus on the News. We've got our very dear friend Jim Jatras, who is with us. But before we get Jim into the discussion of our topic today, which is that Trump has said that Biden provoked the war in Ukraine, really a bombshell announcement by him. I just want to mention a couple of things very quickly. The Telegraph did an article saying that CDC head Anthony Fauci has admitted that closing schools for an entire year was a mistake. They should have been open sooner, he says. Well, they never should have been closed. But in any event, now that we're graduating children with 11 years of school instead of 12 years, he's decided, well, I guess we shouldn't have done that. But in any event, so that's it's good at least to hear the government admit when it makes a massive mistake like that. The other thing I just want to touch on lightly is the Boy Scouts. A very sad thing. The Boy Scouts has lost 850,000 members, roughly 43% of its entire membership since they began admitting homosexuals and girls as part of a very radical leftist move. And now they're changing the name. It's forever. It's been the Boy Scouts of America. And now they're changing it to Scouting America. Rather strange news. But in any event, the good news is that as the Boy Scouts are withering away, the boys are shifting in very large numbers to Christian scouting groups like Trail Life and Awana. And I highly recommend both of those groups. I've given out awards to boys at Trail Life. For all practical purposes, they're getting their Eagle Award. I don't know that they call it the Eagle Award, but it amounts to the same thing. I recommend both of those Christian groups very highly. Your kids are safe with them. I can't assure you that's the case with the other group, Scouting America. I just don't know enough, but I know that Scouting America is open to some rather bad elements, and I think it's probably good to move on from there. So with that, we've got really one of the great experts on foreign affairs with us today, Jim Jatras, who's spent a lifetime with the United States Senate and with various organizations like that. I recently saw him at an event where he was wearing the cross, this very high medal that he was awarded by Serbia for the work that he's done to put a spotlight on some of the things that were going on there, and I congratulated him when I saw him, and I again congratulate you, Jim, on that. But with that, let's see if we can get into our discussion. There's a news outfit called Liga has published this article. It says, Biden's words about Ukraine joining NATO provoked Putin into war, says Trump. And I'm just going to read one of Trump's quotes, and then we'll launch into our discussion. Trump said this just 3 days ago, and I quote, "For 20 years, I've heard that if Ukraine goes into NATO, it's a real problem for Russia. I've heard that for a long time. And I think that's really how this war started. Biden was saying all the wrong things. And one of the wrong things he was saying, no, Ukraine will go into NATO, Trump said. When I listened to him speak, I said, this guy's going to start a war, Trump added. Well, of course, we have the war, and Trump went on to say, if you look at the rhetoric from Biden, he was saying the opposite of what, in my opinion, you had to say. The things he was saying, and he's still saying it, he's just saying things that are crazy, added the presidential candidate. So in any event, this has led us into this gargantuan and very terrible war. Jim, what are your thoughts on this? Now Trump has always been critical, but this is the first time I have heard him attribute blame for the war to the United States rather than to Russia. Is that your impression, or do you have a different take on this?
No, I agree with you. I don't think he's ever said that as precisely as he did in this statement. I guess the first thought occurred to me when I heard this was, we've got the debate coming up on Thursday, and I'm wondering, you pointed out there hasn't been much news coverage on this, but I wonder if the other side is preparing its counterstrike to say, aha, try to revive the whole Russiagate thing. There's Trump being Putin's bagman now to take his line on these things and put the blame on the U.S. policy rather than Russia. The other thing that occurred to me, though, is, of course, the statement that Ukraine and also Georgia will become members of NATO comes from the 2008 Bucharest summit of NATO. And that was a statement that of U.S. policy as well, since, we're the leading country in NATO. At any time during his 4 years in office, Trump, as president, could have said, we no longer stand by that declaration. It was just a declaration. It's not a treaty. So it's something that he, as president, could have countermanded by saying, this is no longer the policy of the United States. He didn't do that. Now, maybe he wasn't as fully aware of it then as he is now that the war is blown up in everybody's face. So it's good to see him saying this. I wish he had said it earlier when he was actually in a position to do something about it, but we'll see. Maybe he will be again.
I would say on that particular issue, in Trump's defense, his cabinet and the entire federal bureaucracy was almost in revolt against the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. The president, he's hanging onto his hat, trying to fend off attacks on every side, going back to 2016. And while it would have been very good for him to withdraw from that, the fact is that he probably was thinking of other things at the time. And, along those lines, there's a tremendous CNN article. It's an online CNN article, and it's something like five ways in which a new Trump administration would be different. They do an outstanding job. And they lay out the difference in terms of what the congressional support will be. Congress, even though it was, in Republican hands, it was intensely anti-Trump. It was intensely opposed to the grassroots America. And that has changed very dramatically. They made that point. And also the courts were extraordinarily hostile. Today, there's much greater balance. The Supreme Court is reasonably solid, and so hopefully the bureaucracy and the cabinet also will be much more pro-Trump, because of course for the top officials he's got to get them through Senate confirmation. And back when we had all of these Republican clowns in the Senate who were against Trump, he couldn't get good people through. So it's going to be a much different environment should he win this election, I think.
I think that's a very good point. And I would say that the populist Trump wing of the party, which is overwhelming among the voters, at least the Republican voters, is still a minority among office holders. So in other words, when you get to the Senate and the House, even more so in the Senate than the House, it's still a minority. But even a lot of the people who are, you might say regular Republicans, are starting to get the message and are starting to tack into that direction. So maybe you're right. Maybe he will have a better chance of getting his nominees through if they're good nominees, because personnel is policy. If you have bad people running your administration, you're not going to get good policies, no matter what the president wants. But you have to ask too, though. I mean, even things like the National Security Advisor, which is key, which doesn't require Senate confirmation. I mean, if you're going to put John Bolton in, you're not going to get any departure from the mistakes of the past. You're, for example, as you know, John Bolton is widely credited with torpedoing Trump's outreach to North Korea with, his friend Little Rocket Man. So those are some of the key decisions that will have to be made if he does win.
Yeah, going off on John Bolton, Trump, some people say, well, Trump said he was going to get out of Syria and he didn't get out of Syria. He tried 3 times. I have an intense interest in Syria. And at one point, he simply made a public announcement. He said, I am ordering all troops out of Syria, and we're going to get out of there right now. And immediately on the heels of that, James Mattis, who was then the Secretary of Defense, resigned in order to break the chain of command so that order would not be executed. And simultaneous with that, John Bolton flew over, I believe it was to Tel Aviv, and landed and announced that the United States was not pulling troops out of Syria. And essentially just countermanded the orders of the President of the United States. And I don't know what I'd have done had I been president at that time, but it would have made John Bolton very, very unhappy.
Yeah. I don't. You're the former officer here, so maybe you can tell me how this works in the chain of command. I mean, even if the Secretary of Defense resigns, every uniformed officer is still subject to the president as commander in chief. I mean, he cannot just call up General X and say, General, withdraw those forces from Syria. That's a direct order. I mean, how does, I don't know how that works or how that doesn't work.
Well, you are correct. The military is designed so that in a battle, if I'm the commanding general and I'm shot and killed, somebody steps up and he's now the commander of that unit.
Right.
And that goes all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. The problem is that with the bureaucracy, the president issues an order. Now, he doesn't have some appendices that lay out when and how and who and all of this stuff. He just expresses the commander's intent, and that's supposed to be carried out. However, going all the way back to Bill Clinton, Obama, Biden, they have stacked the military bureaucracy, particularly the officer corps, with ideologically driven political figures who know ways of dragging things out, of impeding things. And they don't take their orders from the president. They take their orders from this amorphous foreign policy establishment. And they just simply decide, in some cases, we're just not going to do it. Now, if the president is, if President Trump is elected in November, he must clean house with all of the flag and general officers so that he get people who will smoothly carry out the commander's intent and do it rapidly. Now, I'll tell you what I would do if I were the president is I would have the Secretary of Defense. I would actually appoint a person who would be in charge, and he would be required to communicate with the National Security Agency or National Security Council, and inform me as president, what are you doing today? What's your timeline? And there are only two organizations that are present. You've got the one group that's small. It's like a company-size operation that operates near the Jordanian border, and then you've got the northern area that operates along with the Kurds, and so we literally have occupied and have military control over a sovereign nation, Syria, which is exactly what we're complaining about the Russians doing in Ukraine. Is you're crossing the sacred sovereign borders. Well, we're crossing sacred sovereign borders on the other side of the globe, and it doesn't seem to bother us. But the president this time, through the National Security Council, needs to personally take control, and he needs to have reports made. And if somebody does not, for example, pull out of the place that's adjacent to Jordan within 72 hours, he needs either to have a really, really persuasive reason why, or he needs to relieve that officer for command, retire him from the service, and replace him with somebody else. And these things can be done on the order of the President of the United States, but he's got to have the bandwidth. If he's so much on the defensive like he was before, it's hard to do that. But he could appoint somebody like me as a special envoy to go over, and I could get the full cooperation of the Syrian government in carrying out a smooth transition, a respectful transition, one that would ensure the safety of all American soldiers, the return of American property, and it would allow the United States to withdraw with a complete sense of dignity and mutual respect with the Syrian government, so that it wouldn't involve any of the upheavals that we saw when we pulled out of Afghanistan. It's very doable, but you've got to have real, live, accountable people who essentially report to the president along with the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, and this again is another indication of why personnel is key, especially personnel that don't require Senate confirmation. You mentioned the NSC. I mean, while you were talking, I was thinking, he needs like a political commissar over at the Pentagon, maybe a former state senator who's got experience with the Judge Advocate General, who could be in a position to ride on the Pentagon and make sure they do what they're ordered to do. So I think you'd be perfect for that job. I hope he's watching.
Well, I'm not sure that I would be the president's national security advisor, but at least on that particular thing, I have,
Yeah.
personal relations with and trust with the Syrian government, and because I opposed our support for Al Qaeda and our on and off support for ISIS from the very beginning, and so that they know that I understand what's going on in the war, and I think almost as a personal out of personal respect for me, I think President Assad would say yes, uh, we will cooperate fully with you, and we will ensure that when the United States withdraws, it is with complete safety, respect, and dignity, and it would just be smooth as silk. That's what we need, and just get out of that mess once and for all. Let peace return to Syria. Uh, the idea that the United States could actually restore peace is awfully appealing. We're at war so many places that you can't even count them anymore. So we've got to do that. Back to the issue with Trump's comment. It's interesting because I pulled up the WikiLeaks cable. WikiLeaks did a tremendous service to the American people by publishing some of the goings on of our own government, and there was this 2008 cable that was sent by the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, and it went to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to NATO, National Security Council, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and it basically laid out in fairly firm terms the likelihood that if the United States continued to press for membership in NATO for Ukraine and for Georgia, that it was very likely to force Russia to decide whether to go to war over it. They couldn't possibly allow Ukraine right on their very border to be part of a hostile offensive military alliance, which is what NATO has become.
That's right. It's you mentioned Trump's comment, and we were talking before the show that Nigel Farage had said something similar, but he also, for some odd reason, said that we provided the pretext for what Putin wanted to do in the first place, and that's false. I mean, it's pretty clear that this is the last thing that Moscow wanted to do, but it's pretty clear when the U.S. and NATO rejected those two draft treaties from Moscow in December of 2021 that there were a lot of people in the West rubbing their hands with the glee at the thought that, okay, now the Russians are going to go in and we can really bleed them white, because they thought that they'd be able to inflict some serious defeats on the Russians, that they'd be overstretched, that they'd be suffer another Afghanistan, really, in Ukraine. And of course, that hasn't turned out to be the case. What has been the case, unfortunately, is just with a ghoulish glee that these people have over how many Ukrainians are dying. But at least it's hurting the Russians too. So if it's worthwhile to kill off so much of Ukraine, as long as we can hurt the Russians too. I mean, there's not even any strategic sense to this anymore. It just seems to be pure some kind of satisfaction of the carnage that's going on there. I was trying to crunch some numbers recently. You'll recall, Senator, from having served in Vietnam, a bad week in Vietnam, we were losing about 200 people a week, and that's in a country of 200 million people at the time. Ukraine is lucky if they have 20 million people left in that country under the control of Kiev, which is 1/10 of the American population in those days. But they're losing not 200 a week; they're losing 2,000 a day now. I mean, the casualty rate has gone up tremendously. I mean, you look at that ratio; that's like, hundreds to one in terms of, depending on how many people are getting killed each day. 300, 400, 700 to one, what we were losing in attrition in Vietnam back in those days. And we saw what that did to this country. What is happening to Ukraine? That these people are willing to throw that many people down into the earth being killed, but we're hurting the Russians. So that's the important thing here. That's the only important thing that these people can see. It's beyond ghoulish. It's beyond inhuman that what these people are doing.
The willingness to embark on war is quite remarkable for the United States. We came out of the Cold War. The Cold War, there were lots of reasons why that was going on. And I certainly supported our stiff defenses against the Soviet Union. When Germany was broken, you had East Germany and West Germany. I was one of the troops who was defending the West, and was quite confident of the justness of the cause. But the problem is that when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, it dissolved peacefully. Just one of the greatest blessings of mankind in history was the fact that ended without some great war. And you had NATO and you had the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the NATO equivalent on the Soviet side. The Warsaw Pact just dissolved. It just went away into nothing. And I can remember at the time being very conscious, and I had nothing but criticism for the Soviet Union. Believe me, I was ready to die fighting the Soviet Union. But as the Soviet Union disappeared, and Russia and the Eastern European countries were struggling with how do we now reorganize ourselves? I was acutely aware of the fact that NATO should have dissolved just like the Warsaw Pact, and it didn't. And it began to make me very uneasy shortly after the Soviet Union fell, that here we had this massive alliance that at the time it really was a defensive alliance. And it was always trying to send that message. This is defensive. This is defensive. And then over the later years, it became obvious that it was not defensive. It began marching. We had made agreements that we were not going to move NATO 1 inch to the east. And at that time, there was a 1,000-mile buffer between East and West. And so instead of having nuclear powers nose to nose, you had them 1,000 miles apart, which increased the safety of mankind enormously. And then I watched as they marched east in a terrible way. And then the idea of literally taking what had once been a defensive alliance and now was an intensely militaristic, aggressive alliance, and taking them to the very border of Russia was simply outrageous. And I think Trump, in his own way, he, without going into the detail, he was generally expressing this, that we provoked this by trying to move NATO into Ukraine.
That's right. And of course, the expansion of NATO was also combined with dropping the mask of a defensive alliance, which you're right, it had been during the Cold War, in my opinion. But then you look at the Balkans and especially Kosovo in 1999, which was anything but defensive. Sometimes you'll hear people say, a lot of people in the West haven't realized the Soviet Union is gone, and they still pursued a Cold War policy toward Russia. Would that were the case? Because back during the Cold War, when there was communism, there was actually a great deal of respect and restraint in our policy toward the Soviet Union and toward the communist bloc. But as soon as communism ended and Russia became more of a state with a national and even Christian ethos, we saw a level of hostility that we never demonstrated against the Soviet Union. We were never as recklessly hostile to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact as we are against Russia today. We never saw the demonization of Khrushchev or Brezhnev or even Stalin the way Putin is demonized by the Western establishment. So there's something, there's something going on that's much deeper than just an inertia from the previous American policy. There was almost like somebody fired a starting gun when the wall came down to say, great, now we can force the rainbow flag on the rest of the world here and create a sort of a global woke empire. And if countries like Russia or Syria or Iran or China, whoever it is, stand in our way, well, then, we're going to have to take them down too. And this is something I think a lot of Americans, especially conservative Americans, who are often very critical of our policies here at home, will somehow imagine it's still all mom and apple pie when it comes to the rest of the world, that we're out there, for truth, justice, and the American way. Well, I wish it were so, but it ain't so. I mean, what we're doing in the rest of the world, I think a lot of Americans, well, you mentioned, for example, our support for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. There was just another big terrorist attack in southern Russia last day or so in Dagestan, where a bunch of Islamic radicals killed, I think, last count, 19 people at several churches and I think a couple of synagogues in Dagestan. And of course, we had the big terrorist attack in near Moscow a few weeks ago. And nobody seems to pick up on this. Who's supporting these groups like ISIS? Was there a connection with the Ukrainian services that we're supporting through our tax dollars? I don't think a lot of Americans understand just how bad some of the things that are being done with our money and in our name are.
Yes, be curious your thoughts, but I'm always suspicious of the Central Intelligence Agency when I hear that there's an uprising of Muslims in Dagestan or Chechnya or something like that, or the Crocus theater attacks. That there's always sort of that invisible hand of the Central Intelligence Agency, and there's an old saying in politics, nothing ever just happens in politics, and it's always deliberately caused. So I don't know that that's 100% true, but there's truth to it.
That's right. I mean, look, that's one of the problems here is if there was a connection, you can have a strong, well-based suspicion that there is one. But when the evidence comes out later on that there was, it'll be like a little footnote on some website somewhere. Nobody would care. I mean, we saw this, for example, with that 2012 memo from the Defense Intelligence Agency about how they knew that if we kept supporting these jihadist groups in Syria, something like what they called, I think, a Salafist principality would emerge in eastern Syria, what turned out to be ISIS. And General Flynn himself said this was not an accident. This was deliberate. They did this on purpose because they thought such an entity could be a big pressure on the Syrian government. Does anybody care? Nobody cares. I mean, it's like a non-story. When Trump back in 2016 accused Obama and Hillary of being the founder and co-founder of ISIS, He was absolutely right. But when you tried to get his campaign to pick up on that and really hammer home, they'd already been subverted by a lot of the Republican regulars from the Bush administration who just wanted to continue the same story. Oh no, it was our premature withdrawal from Iraq that caused the problem. Had nothing to do with our support for, with money and weapons for these various terrorist groups. It's a real formidable problem. I think you're right about the CIA and of course their buddies over at MI6 in the
Yes.
United Kingdom. I almost wonder if any president can really control his administration unless he sends like a team of 500 lawyers, accountants, and special agents over to Langley, take over the place, and find out what the hell they've been up to for all these years.
Well, Jim, I appreciate your comments. Always very insightful. I am very pleased to see that Trump has a pretty clear picture of what's going on. That this war in Ukraine was provoked by the Biden administration. I think it's a very major story. It hasn't hit the Western press yet. Maybe it will at some point. But in any event, the struggle will go on, and we'll keep informing people as it does. So with that, we will see you all next Monday. This has been Focus on the News with Senator Black and with Jim Jatras. We will see you next Monday.